So we didn't know that our breakout session would be in the ballroom until 5 minutes ago. No. And this is a big space, right? And we've been in here all morning. I would welcome everyone, if you could, to please come to these first few rows. Come in, get closer. Let's make this feel more like one of the other rooms downstairs. I think it'll help with the discussion. I'm so happy that you're all here. I'll introduce myself. I'm Kylie. I'm the Senior Program Manager for Climate Justice at B-Lab US in Canada, and I'm so happy to be here with you all and these wonderful, wonderful folks that will be sharing about how to center your climate action in justice. We have been having a lot of really wonderful conversations for the last couple days, and I've really been looking forward to this one. And I want to take some time now to invite you all to participate in the poll that we have up here on our first slide. And I also want to introduce our speakers. So just a word or two from them about their role, and then we'll go ahead and dig into what we'll cover today. And I'll start with David.
Hi all, thank you for being here. I'm David Jaber, the founder of Climate Positive Consulting, and we work with businesses to help develop their greenhouse gas reduction strategy.
Hi everyone, I'm Tory Hoffmeister, also very excited to be here today. I'm a manager on the climate strategy consulting practice at 3 Degrees, which is a global climate solutions provider. Our mission is to help businesses fight climate change, and we do that by helping businesses set credible and ambitious climate goals.
And I'm Taylor Stanley. I work for Riverside Natural Foods. I'm the sustainability specialist. I lead the initiatives at our company. We're a food manufacturer. You might not know Riverside, though. No one really does. Made Good is our flagship brand of granola bars, organic, allergen-free. And our purpose as an organization is to inspire a healthier, more compassionate world. And climate is a huge part of that, especially climate justice. So happy to be here.
Great, thank you all. And can I get back to that poll? How do I go back? There we go. Okay, so if you could take out your phone and go to menti.com, enter this code. We're also a small group, so we could do show of hands, but let's do the phone because then we can see it up here and it'll look cool. So does your company have, check all that apply, a greenhouse gas footprint, a reduction strategy, what was the other one here? A DEI goal or strategy, and a climate justice goal or strategy. So if you could just take a minute to sit with those questions, and hopefully you can enter the code there. Great, so I see some answers coming in. Great. So it seems like, we're a group of maybe 25 or so about a third of us have a DEI goal or strategy at your company. Next is a greenhouse gas footprint, yes. An emission reduction goal or strategy. And of course, the bar for a climate justice goal or strategy is the shortest, and that's why we're all here, right? And why I'm really excited to hear from this wonderful panel of folks. Great. Thank you. So we're here today to answer this question: how can B Corps lead the way in making progress on climate action centered in justice? That's a big question. It's a huge question. It's one that I've been sitting with a lot over the last couple days. No one person, team, company, cohort of companies can figure it out. It really takes every single one of us thinking about that and bringing in some of those ideas and centering frontline voices as we do that, which I'll get into in a moment. What are the success stories and what are the challenges? So I hope that that's what you take away from today, is real live examples of how this work is being done. So I'll provide some grounding in what climate justice is. Quick raise of hands, who's been in one of the climate sessions already? Yeah, so we're all in the same crowd. So you've heard these definitions over the last couple days, so I won't spend too much time, but really, climate justice links human rights and sustainability. It calls us to place people and equity at the center of climate action, and it focuses on the most systematically oppressed people and communities who are already and will be affected first and worst by climate change. And last but not least, it recognizes that the crisis has been mainly brought about by those with economic power and privilege, while the effects have a disproportionately negative effect on historically marginalized and underserved communities, mostly people of color and low-income communities. And I know I come here to this session, like we all did from this morning, sitting with a lot of that. So the climate justice work at B-Lab US and Canada has evolved a lot in the last couple years. It's also very new. I started in May, I'm just 6 months in, and I'm the first dedicated staff for this work at B-Lab. So we, just like the racial equity program, are very much so on the beginning of our journey in terms of what we can do and the impact we can bring, and I'm excited about that. One of the pieces that was in place before I got here was the Climate Justice Playbook for Business. Can I get a quick show of hands who recognizes this? Okay, keep your hand up if you've read parts of it. Keep your hand up if you've read the whole thing. Hey. So I won't lie, it's a long resource, it's like 70 pages, but there's so much in it, so many gems, so much guidance. It asks way more questions than it provides answers. It's really not so much a playbook, we joke internally, but more of a question book. But there's a lot in it that's really worth taking a look at and sitting down with. It was produced last year, and as we look forward to the next year, we're interested in how do we not create a second version of the playbook, but how do we keep the existing playbook with additions around centering frontline voices, because while they strove to do that and they did a good job, they fell short in a lot of ways, and that's the work ahead, is how to do that better. I'll just ground our conversation today before I turn it over in this mindset shift. So you can read this graph, it's in the playbook, but really we're talking about moving from extractive and exploitative to equitable and regenerative. And I think a lot of that has to do with what was covered this morning around being valuable versus being valued, right? I'm really sitting with that after hearing that. This is something that we focus a lot on in the playbook and in the work ahead. So I will wrap up by just speaking a little bit to how we've been trying to center frontline voices in our work. This summer, fall, we met with 10 organizations and we interviewed them. We had really deep, tough conversations with them, asking them very direct, blunt questions about our work, what they do, how they collaborated with business, where have been the pain points, where is business falling short, where is businesses causing actual harm in their communities. We also asked them for feedback on the playbook, gave them a condensed version. So right now we're taking all of these interviews and we're really thinking about how do we incorporate these insights into our work ahead. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to David and Tory, who will run us through some of the climate action tools that you can use at your company to move forward on climate action centered in justice. And then they'll turn it over to Taylor, who will talk to how this is actually happening on the ground at his company. And then we're actually going to break out into some smaller discussions. I know the room isn't really set up for that, but we'll figure it out because that's what we do at Champions Retreat. And then we'll close and get everyone on to lunch. Thank you.
Thank you, Kylie. So the driving reason that I'm here on the panel, and the reason I suspect many of you, or at least part of the reason I suspect many of you came here, is ever since B-Lab US and Canada announced their 3 pillars of change, I think it was in January 2021, so that's racial equity, climate justice, and stakeholder-based capitalism, I've really been wrestling with how climate justice shows up in our climate work. And this is not only true for us internally as an organization, because we have committed to net zero by 2030, like many other B corporations has, but it's at least as pertinent to our work with other companies because developing climate strategy is what we do. So the core of climate strategy, as we would practice that, is measuring climate impact. And whether you call that greenhouse gas accounting, whether you call it carbon footprinting, whether you call it greenhouse gas inventory or other words you might come up with, it's essentially this same process that you have to go through if you're going to do implementation in an informed way and really know where your largest impacts are. And so my initial premise is that climate justice should show up in this accounting process in some way. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page, we do want to go over the basics of greenhouse gas accounting. If you're very familiar with greenhouse gas accounting, just please bear with me for a few minutes kind of while we work through it. And the diagram you see on the screen captures graphically, what we're looking at. So the first step in accounting is to set your boundaries. For most companies, there is a test you use to do that of operational control. And what that means is you look at the facilities and fleets where you either lease or you own, but essentially you're making decisions about what happens in those assets. There's also, for investors and holding companies, they're actually sort of a financial control test because they're not doing operational control, but they still are making decisions that affect what these businesses do. So, but for most companies that produce a product and a lot of service companies, you're looking at the operational test. So once you do that and have set your boundaries, the facilities and fleets comprise what they call Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So the direct emissions out of those facilities and fleets, that's Scope 1. And so that would be things like burning gasoline, burning fossil fuel, a lot of combustion processes, and escaped refrigerants. Scope 2 are indirect. And for most companies, that's just electricity. It's essentially the utilities that are coming into your buildings. You're making decisions, but the emissions don't happen there. They happen at the other end of the wires where the power plant is. And then Scope 3 is also indirect, and it's everything else in your value chain outside of the utilities that's indirect. So that's the first test or the first step to set your boundaries. The second step is to do data collection, essentially, and gather information on all the kilowatt hours, therms, gallons, pounds of supplies that you're purchasing, all these different things that are greenhouse gas sources within those boundaries. And then the third step is to find the emission factors that let you translate all those kilowatt hours and therms and gallons and ton miles into carbon equivalent. And when you work through that, essentially that is kind of how you quantify your footprints. So those of you that were bearing with me, I think we can get to maybe some of the more interesting parts of that conversation. But so back to my question of how climate justice shows up in this process. My conclusion is that it doesn't. Greenhouse gas accounting is this internal process of kind of looking inside your own operations and kind of counting numbers. Where climate justice, as Kylie was just talking about, is effects on the external world. But what greenhouse gas accounting can do is lead you to interventions that will create touch points within the external community and are places where you can advance climate justice. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tory to talk more about interventions.
Thanks, David. So like David said, we're going to talk through some of the specific interventions onto which companies can layer climate justice and climate equity. On the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to go through interventions by each of the scopes of emissions that David just went over, just to make sure we're all speaking the same language as we go forward and discuss ways to address climate justice in the rest of this panel. So first we have Scope 1 solutions, which are solutions that companies can use to address their direct, owned, or controlled emissions. So those are things like shifting processes that are currently powered by burning fuels to be powered by electricity, and improving the energy efficiency of processes that burn fuels or use electricity. And an example of something you could do in this space is electrify your vehicle fleet. Companies can also use instruments called carbon credits, the same thing as carbon offsets, to address any emissions in this space that are left over after they reduce emissions as much as possible. And a carbon credit or offset refers to the exclusive right to claim a greenhouse gas reduction or removal by another actor as your own. And we're going to circle back to those later in our discussion. Next, we have Scope 2 solutions, which are solutions that companies can use to reduce their indirect emissions from purchased electricity. And these solutions are basically just different ways of getting at renewable energy. So it might be installing on-site solar, it might be contracting to offtake renewable energy from a renewable energy plant, or it might be purchasing energy attribute certificates or renewable energy certificates as they're called in the US or Canada. We often refer to them as RECs. And a REC represents the green attribute of 1 unit of renewable energy, and those can be bought and sold and separated from the energy itself. Finally, we have Scope 3 solutions, which are solutions that companies can use to address all of their other indirect emissions, so emissions upstream and downstream of their operations, emissions from their investments, et cetera. So one example of something companies might do in this space is engage with their value chain, with their suppliers, to have their suppliers begin measuring and reducing their emissions. They might shift their procurement to lower carbon suppliers, and they might also consider decarbonizing the fleets of vehicles that either bring materials to their company or distribute their products. Again, companies can use carbon credits or carbon offsets to address residual emissions or leftover emissions in this space once they've reduced as much as possible. One final point that I want to draw out on this slide before I hand it over to Taylor is that companies are poised to invest a great deal of time and money and effort in some combination of the interventions that you see on the slide right now in the next 2 decades, as a lot of companies approach their 2050 net zero goals, or preferably their 2030 net zero goals. And so right now is really a critical juncture to take a step back and ask ourselves what criteria and goals companies can add on to those investments to, at the very least, ensure that they don't repeat or exacerbate the environmental racism of the past, or at best to ensure that those investments are a positive force for building equity and justice moving forward. So with that, I will pass it to you, Taylor.
Thank you very much, Tory and David. So that's a lot of things to consider, and you saw the distinction between direct and indirect, and operational control, and where you don't have control. So, as I mentioned, I lead the sustainability initiatives. I'm the only one with sustainability in my title at the organization, right? So I can't do it alone. It needs to be embedded throughout the organization. So I support our facilities team to find solutions to help reduce our scope 1 and 2. My main focus is trying to figure out how to tackle scope 3. And as David mentioned, the first step is doing the calculation. And the calculations are not perfect, not even close to being perfect, but they are directional, and they can help you get started. Progress before perfection is one of our mantras at Riverside Natural Foods. And again, maybe another point, you really do need some executive buy-in. Maybe I shouldn't say some, you need a lot of executive buy-in to be making any substantial changes. You can maybe get away with doing some measurements without the top signing off on it, but to actually implement any change, we're talking about how we converse and how we relate to other organizations that we partner with. So your director of procurement, to your sales team and their downstream partnerships. So for us, we went through the exercise of calculating our scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint. Scope 1 and 2, relatively straightforward. We don't have any refrigerants. We don't own a big fleet. We got a couple company cars. And I'm actually very excited about the plans we have for scope 1 and 2, because we have direct control, we have executive buy-in, and we have an ambition to achieve our science-based targets. So some examples of things that we're doing, as all of our company vehicles go off of lease, we're only bringing in new electric vehicles. So our portion of scope 1 that's related to the fleet emissions are going to be gone, I think by mid next year. We'll have the last of the gas-powered fleet cars off of the road. And then, we're a food manufacturing company. We make a lot of granola bars, we make some baked bars, we have a few different brands. So the ovens, represent the vast majority of our gas consumption. And we have committed to, or are now in the process of, I think a couple weeks ago we signed off on the PO to take out these 2-3-year-old gas burners. These are not old pieces of equipment. These are relatively new. Take them out of, I think the mass majority is only one oven we're not doing right now because it's a bit finicky, but I'm talking like 14 zones. We're taking out the gas-powered burners and putting in electric burners. And we had to send our facilities team to Norway to go find another company that's doing this kind of work with the electric-powered ovens. So we're putting our money where our mouth is, and we're making an effort. And our purpose, as I mentioned, to inspire a healthier, more compassionate world. To do that inspire piece, we have to take the first step, right? You kind of got to pay the green premium. So what that's going to result in is a shift. Hopefully by 2024, we'll be out of the scope 1 game, and we'll not be burning any. We got to take a look. Our HVAC system, just some water boilers, there's some smaller pieces, but we want to meter each individual asset as we can, find out where the priorities lie, and then roll those through. over the next few years. So that's going to result in a shift from scope 1 to scope 2. There's some efficiency gains in using electricity for some of these to generate some of the heat and some of the power, so it's not going to be equivalent. Hopefully 80% or less will transfer over to scope 2. And then we need to get more savvy about how we're managing our energy, participate in some of the provincial curtailment efforts. So I think if the top 5 peaks in the summer, if we curtail, then that affects what's called the peak demand factor. So the next year we'll actually be paying for less for electricity, and they pay you like $400,000 a megawatt to curtail in those peak times. So you can get savvy and you can get interesting depending on your local context. And we're lucky that we're based in Toronto, so we have a relatively clean grid up in Ontario. Some nuclear is going offline, but that's a topic for another day. But scope 3, this is, as you can see, this is where the beast lives, especially for purchased goods and services as a food company. You'll notice that upstream and downstream transportation, we did not have the capability to measure that last year, but we've got our systems upgraded, so this year we should be able to measure our footprint. But some of the challenges, so I asked around, one of the first things I did when I joined Riverside was do a product life cycle assessment. So I reached out to our suppliers for each individual ingredient, asked them for life cycle assessment data, any carbon footprinting. Can anyone guess what they gave me back? Nothing. Nothing. There's no data. There's not much, at least. Companies, doesn't usually live with companies, with the sales team, right? So learned about, LCA modeling software, EcoInvent database, did a bit of training with the Open LCA team, the free open source software, great modeling software. I recommend checking it out if you're interested. EcoInvent, a pretty nominal fee, so you get 2 years with that, and then you pay an additional fee to upgrade after that. So using the product LCA methodology, you can apply that to your scope 3 as well. And so this is what was a result for our purchased goods and services. Now this is just, we have, didn't count any services. We have direct and indirect consumables. Direct are the consumables that go into our finished product. I didn't count the chairs or the desks or the keyboards or the computers. I'll get to that, right? Sometimes it's a bit of a so what question, right? And what can you actually impact? So we're focusing on the food, right? We're a food company, so we're focusing on the ingredients and the packaging. And so this was just this was the top 80% of our direct consumables by dollars spent. And then as well, you can see the employee commuting was another interesting one. Sent out a survey, got about 150 responses, averaged that data out. It's a pretty representative sample size, and use that to multiply that just by our total number of employees. So we can actually do some, we have some more direct control over that. So, but anyway, purchased goods and services, the next slide can kind of show an example of a project that we already started before I even joined. Before we did the scope 3 measurement, we knew that our efforts for reducing our environmental footprint come from the food that we source, right? So this was the first year of our pilot project for regenerative organic oats out in Saskatchewan with our partners at MGM Seed and Grain. That's where we source our oats. And then the subject matter experts are Canadian organic growers. That is Chris Nichols in the middle picture there on her knees. She's a rock star in the regenerative ag space. She worked at the Rodale Institute for about 20 years. We've got Ryan Potts on the left side and Eric in the back. Ryan's a farmer. Eric is the manager of the program. And then myself and one of our co-founders, executive buy-in, right? One of our co-founders and our director of procurement, Salma Fodavat, and another farmer there, Colin. So there's not as many human rights issues when it comes to the prairies in Canada and Saskatchewan. So when we talk about justice, that bar chart I showed you for scope 3 emissions, that's not where justice happens, as David said, right? This is not, that's just directional, and it points you in where you have to go to actually find out how to do the justice work. So chocolate came out as the most potentially emissive ingredient. It's all information from West Africa. We get our chocolate from Peru. So we're working right now, I've been working all year with our chocolate suppliers to try and get a project online that can measure a social baseline as well as an environmental baseline so that we can actually create some initiatives to drive some measurable change, reduce our emissions, but also improve the quality of life for those individuals, specifically focusing on female-owned farms, and their families. So yeah, I'm happy to answer more questions later, but that's kind of the journey we're on right now, and I'm excited. Hopefully by the next championship retreat, I'll have some pictures from Peru. So thank you.
Thank you all for sharing. I know I just learned a couple things I didn't know, so thank you. So in the spirit of inclusivity and pivoting on the fly, which again, this is Champions Retreat, it's what we do, I want to honor all the folks that are joining us virtually, and if it's okay with y'all, pivot from the breakouts to just panel discussion, ask you some questions, and then take some questions from the audience. Does that sound good? Great, okay. We see you folks at home. All right, so I have a few questions that are coming up, and I would love to ask these and have each of you answer. You know, I think there's a lot of expertise here, and I really want to dig into some of this in a little more detail. So we've just learned a lot about Climate Action 101. We heard some good examples of what Taylor's doing at Riverside. What are some concrete examples of things companies can do to advance climate justice while progressing on climate action? What are some concrete examples of ways to center justice in your climate action? And we can go David, Tory, Taylor.
Sure, and I'll work on getting my way to concrete, but it might take a little time. So I'm going to stick with my greenhouse gas accounting theme and kind of trying to integrate climate justice with that. I guess my caveat is that if you go back to the list that Kylie showed earlier, maybe around slide 5, where it was talking about human rights and kind of protecting the most vulnerable and these different aspects of climate justice, it looks very different than working on your oven efficiency or doing more efficient trucks. The list of things that you would do internally as actions is often looks very externally toward the outcomes that we want from climate justice. But that said, I think even though I think there does need to be sort of a separate process, leveraging what you're going to do in your different direct greenhouse gas reduction efforts, makes a lot of sense. And I think I'm also going to offer a corollary that to advancing climate justice and making sure that those that are most hurt by the issue get some benefit or some recompense for kind of what's been done to them. A corollary is that your climate actions should not be creating more injustice. So it's not exactly advancing climate justice, but it's also not advancing injustice. And I think there's a few ways, I think, to look at that. One is if you're doing sort of a large-scale project that would have some community impacts, like a large-scale solar array, or maybe working with if you have a fleet of trucks that's managing your freight, looking at their idling practices, because I know in some communities actually like emissions from diesel trucks is kind of an issue. But do community engagement to really understand, what would be the potential concerns with any intervention, like large-scale renewables, working with trucking, even like regenerative agriculture practices, not imposing those on farmers, but actually having a conversation with farmers about kind of what actually would work. I think community engagement's kind of one, and I think I'll probably just maybe stop there and let others, kind of go into some other examples before moving on.
Thank you. So I am going to provide a couple really tactical examples that I've seen in 3 Degrees consulting work of how companies can incorporate justice and center justice in their climate action. And the reason I think these super concrete examples are useful is because I think it is really hard to come up with a universal list of actions that any company can take on climate justice, since what justice and equity look like in any given community will be so dependent on looking to the leaders in that community for their guidance on what interventions could advance equity and justice. So I have a couple examples in mind of ways that companies can center equity and justice in renewable energy procurements to start. So one big example is Microsoft has recently begun announcing climate justice investment and grant pledges linked to some of its big renewable energy procurement announcements. So for example, they recently announced a 500 megawatt procurement of solar energy, and linked to that, a $50 million investment fund for climate justice related projects. And as part of that, they also developed a scorecard in collaboration with an advisory group of climate justice and environmental justice organizations to help them identify and define which projects advance climate justice most. And the reason I bring this up is I know a lot of companies don't have the opportunity to invest $50 million in climate justice, but I do think this scorecard, which Microsoft has published, can be really useful reading for other companies that are also starting to wonder how they will define climate justice. And that was also Microsoft's intention in publishing it. And the scorecard looks at, first, the planning of projects and who leads projects. So it asks, is a project being led by, or does it genuinely involve a community-serving organization that has a pre-existing relationship with the community where the project will be located? And it also looks at whether the planning of the project is inclusive of community members. It then looks at benefits that the project is going to deliver to priority populations. So in addition to decarbonization benefits, it looks at some social benefits, like health benefits that come from air pollution remediation, in addition to economic inclusion benefits, like wealth building in a community, and resource access benefits, like making utilities more affordable for communities. Another example of how companies can center justice in their renewable energy procurements is by using justice and equity criteria to decide among different renewable energy project options and different project developers with whom they might partner. So that means in addition to typical criteria that companies use to choose projects and choose developers, which are things like cost and risk, they could also add equity and justice criteria that look at, what are the project's plans for community engagement? Will the project have health benefits for marginalized communities? Has the project looked into and identified and addressed any environmental justice concerns? And then similarly, when choosing a developer, companies can choose to add criteria to their proposal evaluation. And 3 Degrees has supported several clients that have wanted to do this. And those criteria can ask about the developer's DEI and ESG performance. So questions like, what percentage of your staff and your board of directors are women or people of color? A final renewable energy and justice example that I wanted to give is perhaps the most relevant to B Corps, because a recent study of B Corps that achieved certification between 2017 and 2021 found that a majority of those companies could be classified as organizations in the services sector with minor ecological footprints. So those are organizations probably like law firms, consulting firms, architecture firms, and those organizations tend to have electricity as their largest source of emissions and tend to have electricity somewhere near the bottom of their balance sheets, so a minor expense. And that indicates a really big opportunity for them to spend more than their baseline on electricity and on purchasing renewable energy certificates if that's the route that they choose to go to obtain renewable energy. And they can choose to purchase renewable energy certificates that have a really intentional justice benefit associated with them. So those would be renewable energy certificates that have revenues flowing in part to projects that deliver a justice and equity benefit to a community. So for example, the revenues from rec sales could enable solar panels to be installed on a school or on low-income housing, and then allow those schools or those low-income families to save on their utility bills as a result. And 3 Degrees calls that kind of rec an impact rec. And the impact rec projects tend to be a lot more expensive to set up than other renewable energy projects, and also a lot smaller, which does make the per rec price significantly higher. But I think the fact that 3 Degrees continues to develop these recs and that we've seen a lot of corporate interest in these recs really speaks to their potential value as a tool to bring climate and justice together. 2 very quick final examples, not in the field of renewable energy, where I think companies can bring together climate and justice. One is in strategic procurement of carbon credits and seeking out carbon credits that may come at a price premium, but that deliver really intentional, robust co-benefits to vulnerable communities. So that could be, for example, a cook stoves project that improves indoor air pollution in households that can't otherwise afford efficient cook stoves in developing countries. Or perhaps an electric vehicle charging project that reduces tailpipe emissions in a highly congested urban low-income area. And companies should seek out carbon credits that deliver fair value of that carbon back to the communities that sequester that carbon. So an example would be farmers and landowners that are performing the regenerative agriculture that creates carbon credits should actually receive a fair value for that carbon credit, which may result in a higher price tag for the client at the end. But it's worth it to ensure that your carbon procurements are advancing justice. And then a final example is that I think companies should be very intentional about weaving together justice and climate in creating procurement strategies. You can imagine that if a company were to have a procurement strategy hyper-focused on climate, they might be inclined to automatically switch away from a supplier that perhaps is not yet measuring its emissions or reducing its emissions in favor of a lower carbon supplier, without attention to whether the first supplier is perhaps a small minority-owned business. So if a company can integrate DEI goals and climate goals in crafting a sustainable procurement strategy, they might be more inclined to engage with that supplier and support that supplier and educate them, provide training resources, et cetera, so that they can also begin measuring and reducing their emissions versus just automatically switching away from them. So that is my list of examples. Thank you for bearing with me. I will pass it to Taylor.
Yeah, those are great. There's a lot of good things there, and procurement seems to rise to the top for the, as you saw with our purchased goods and services, right? Depending on your industry, of course, but you can have an outsized impact, I think, in that particular business unit, and even thinking about the electrification. I mean, again, it's procurement. If we switch to electric ovens, we have to get better with managing our electricity, so we want to install a battery. Looking at the battery, that procurement process, where the metal is coming from, how is it being sourced, what are the human rights implications of the mining operations to get those metals, right? So that's, just maybe a fair RFP, internal RFP process, get 2 or 3 different vendors, have some procurement requirements for these different areas of DEI and justice, and reach out to the potential vendors and have those kind of conversations. And again, that requires the director of procurement to be on board with that and embedding it in the sustainability SOPs at your organization. So procurement for everything, for sure, and it's nuanced. And sometimes there's not many options, right? If we want to buy an electric oven, then there's only one vendor, and it's green steel is not as much of a thing right now. Hydrogen, generated steel, it's not really there. So sometimes you're a bit beholden by where technology is, and you kind of have to just do what you think is right. And I think that there's a lot of gray areas when it comes to making these decisions, but the first step, the practical thing you can do, is have these conversations internally, make sure you're aligned on what the goals are, and then have those conversations with your partners. So even with the Peru project that we're talking about, we are not taking the approach of going to tell the farmers what to do. We're taking Spanish lessons starting next week. I don't even speak Spanish, right? So we're going there. We want to leverage the relationships that we have with our partners, and we are comfortable using them as, taking what they say and letting them direct some of our efforts because of the efforts already put into building that relationship. We're already aligned with them and our values, so we know if they think that, and they're the direct contact with the community, and we get in as much as we can, but we kind of know our role. We're up here in Canada, and they live down there in Lima, they're in Tarapoto in the Amazon. They know the community, they know the growers. So we're going to do our part to provide some financial support, some communication support, and amplify with the community that we have with our brand. But making sure that at some point the communities are being consulted, and that what the efforts are that are going into the project are going to have some positive impacts, and it's not going to, like you said, just repeat the cycle. So from the project side, deep collaboration and listening. From the procurement side, having that built into your SOP, and even our example of employee commuting, right? We want to reduce the footprint on all of our Scope 3 categories. The majority of the employees that actually have the smallest commuting footprint are the ones that are working on the front line, that are, you know, first generation Canadians, maybe English is a second language, maybe don't even speak English very well. So if we want to have any efforts to reduce our employee commuting footprint, how do we make sure that those who are already more vulnerable are not being, you know, disproportionately, you know, affected negatively by whatever policies or projects we want to bring in-house to try and reduce that footprint. So providing, you know, we're exploring providing commuting support. So if you take the bus every day, you keep a track of that throughout the year, we'll reimburse that at the end of the year, versus some of our employees in the office who drive to work and, you know, their SUVs kind of thing. So for people who are already doing the right thing, making sure that they're being rewarded for doing that, and then trying to incentivize others to take more sustainable action. But yeah, it's full circle. It's across all the boards, and I just think that the first step to answer that question is having the conversations with the decision makers internally is the biggest one.
Wow. Thank you all. Those were some really tremendous insights. So we do have plenty of time now that we've pivoted on the fly to this panel format. So I have a couple more questions, and then I want to open it up to the audience. So we're talking about the solutions. You all just gave some wonderful examples. I want to talk about the challenges because, again, like I said at the beginning, we all know this is no easy feat. It's overwhelming. It's a huge, huge question that we're trying to answer as individual companies, as people who care, and as the B Corp community. And I think naming those challenges and, you know, kind of sitting with them is really important as we move through this process. So what would you say are the biggest challenges or roadblocks to centering justice and climate action? You know, things that maybe you've seen at your company, but also things that you've seen at other companies. What would you say are the top, like, one or two biggest challenges in actually doing this work?
I can start on this one. Yeah, so this is something I think has been a challenge at 3 Degrees and is a challenge for a lot of companies. I recently joined a working group of various folks working on climate within business, and we asked the question of, you know, where are folks in their climate justice journey? And very many people said that they were still stuck sort of at the beginning because they were struggling with how to define climate justice, especially as separate from environmental justice, and to define what it actually looks like to work meaningfully at the intersection of climate and justice, instead of just combining your decarbonization goal and your DEI goal under a common header. So I think that's a huge challenge, is people feel sort of bogged down with these definitional questions because climate justice is such a nebulous, tricky concept. And they therefore then struggle to understand, like, how do I actually start doing this on the ground? And I think climate justice is so tricky to define and understand what it means on the ground for 2 reasons. One is there's not as I said earlier, there's not a universal list of actions that any company can take to advance climate justice, because it's so important to, as Taylor was saying, listen to local communities on what interventions will be most effective in advancing justice on the ground. And the other reason I think climate justice is so tricky to work on is because the benefits of any given decarbonization project are really diffuse, right? You are contributing marginally to improving the global problem of climate change. The benefits of a decarbonization project aren't necessarily automatically concentrated on a fence line community where you build that project, like they would be if you were doing some sort of water pollution remediation. So given all of that, I think of a potential approach to climate justice in 2 steps. One is taking any given decarbonization action or investment you're thinking about and taking a really intentional step back to ask, what goals or criteria can we add onto this investment so that it actually proactively and intentionally advances justice as well? And then the other piece is looking to local communities to help you answer that question.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I think there's the definitional issue about, like, how you advance climate justice, because the issues, we did present content before, and even in the workshop that was on sort of the first day, but it's a lot of, like, bigger picture, kind of like global social level issues that not only one company is touching on. I think, I think also because of that, one thing I notice, I think I'll just build on that challenge and maybe also kind of get into a solution. I see a lot of companies banding together as we need to push for good policy. Because there's a lot of things that are beyond our own boundaries, and we really need, whether it's like state or kind of federal support to, in California, for example, with the cap and trade system, later on after that cap and trade was passed, where it's, polluting facilities can, or especially buying and trading, and there are climate justice and environmental justice concerns from communities with that, because it's saying, well, then this facility in my community, in theory, can just sort of buy offsets or invest in other places to reduce carbon, but it doesn't actually help me out. But what California legislators ended up getting passed is sort of a certain proportion of cap and trade funds actually went to fund in the most disadvantaged communities, and they have this EnviroScreen tool that actually looks through the state and identifies based on several different indicators, where the most impacted communities are. So I think other states can certainly kind of use that as a model, and also, even if you don't have a cap and trade program, but find other creative ways to develop funds to kind of push them to the right places, because again, as individual companies, these are bigger issues than any one of us can tackle.
Yeah, the advocacy piece is huge. Knowing where and how to lean in as your organization is important, but I'll take a bit of a different approach. Big challenge, like you said, how to define it, right? And then once you define it, then what happens? We only kind of came across as an organization, and myself included, the term climate justice fairly recently, but I'm very privileged to work at an organization where our founders are very loving, thoughtful people. When we were thinking of having to collaborate for a project with our chocolate suppliers, there was never a desire to do anything solely to reduce the carbon intensity per kilogram of cacao produced, right? The impact of the families that are producing the cacao in the local community, that needs to be there. So we already kind of had this approach in our hearts of how we were going to do it, and so I'm very happy to see that, see how it fits in with the more formal climate justice approach and the challenges there. But then, I think the big challenge in any organization is not having these things siloed. I mentioned I'm the only one with sustainability in my title at my organization, and my job is to kind of be the focal point, but it's also to be, the pulse out into the organization. So I need to make sure that I'm doing my best to work with the leaders of each business unit to make sure sustainability is truly embedded in those processes. The more eyes, the more minds and ears we have thinking, watching, and listening about these challenges, the more we can do. So when I get back next week in Toronto, we're having a meeting specifically with our procurement team to really make sure that for 2023, we have a solid definition of exactly what sustainability means within procurement from an environmental, social, and governance perspective. And then, even empowering those individual procurement managers to own those projects with the buyers and the companies that they already have relationships with. So it's not me, traveling around the world to do it. We need to make sure that everyone in the organization, whether you're in procurement, whether you're in facilities, whether you're in sales or marketing, there's always that understanding of what it means, so that each piece of the business can have its own contribution, and the sum of the parts being greater than, or the whole being greater than some of the parts. So I really think that the embedding piece is tough. And again, it always comes back to this executive buy-in. If you don't have that, we're talking about systemic change on a global scale. So if you can't have that change internally as an organization, you don't really have much of a chance. So for the individuals here who work at organizations that are the champions, happy to reach out. Maybe you can, I don't know if I have any wisdom to share, but if you just want to vent too, I'm here to do that. I know I'm very lucky to be in the position I am at my organization, but even, I think one of the powers, one of the many powers that this community offers is, if you work at a B Corp, if you're if you're an executive at a B Corp, and you understand what that means, and you see another B Corp, that kind of, it's the highway to a conversation, or you can fast track to a conversation. So if you are having challenges, and maybe your executive team wants to speak to some executives from a B Corp, I'm sure that my leadership team would be happy to get in touch and have that conversation. So, there's so many challenges, but I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. So I want to stay on that, and Taylor, you just answered it inadvertently without knowing I was going to ask it next. And so if you have any more to share, great. Otherwise, Tory and David, you can share. But I want to talk about that buy-in piece, because if you're at a B Corp, you automatically have the kind of security in knowing that your company cares, right? Your leadership cares. There's a reason why you're a B Corp. You took the assessment. It takes a lot of time and bandwidth and resources. You're in it. But still, I know bandwidth is a continuous issue. It's something that I really sit with in this work. How do we balance pressing companies and supporting them to pursue climate action and then also center justice? It's deep work, and it really requires a lot. So what advice do you have? What have you seen work in terms of employee engagement, executive buy-in? You spoke to coordinating across multiple departments. I mean, for some companies that are at that scale, that's a huge feat. How can you approach that? And, for companies in the room that maybe they're a small company and they have a very small team, how can you still carve out the time to make a difference in this work?
I can speak a bit to that. The time piece, I'm not one to give advice on time management. I'm still working on that every day. But I think being kind of ruthlessly unapologetic about the mission. Like if you work at an organization and you were hired to do this job, then you want to do the job, right? So I think being maybe tactful in how you share this opinion, but be firm in that if we want to achieve these goals, or you hired me to do this, then we need X, Y, Z to happen. I cannot do this alone. We need more people. We need more ideas. So those kind of conversations have to happen. Maybe you two can give some better examples of some companies you've worked with, or even internally, because I think I started off in a very privileged position, but I think that I just think that finding other passionate people in the organization as well, outside of this formal, you don't have to go to your manager to have a chat with someone over coffee, and learning a bit about what their role is. I think that might be the piece. Like if you learn, the more you as the sustainability champion in your organization can learn about how each other business unit functions, then you can find out how to make those ties and make that business case yourself, or even get it to a place where maybe you can ask someone else who's a decision maker in your organization, hey, I'm thinking this could lead to this. I know their goals are that. I know I'm not an expert in that area, but what do you think? Bring something that's more than just a do the right thing, as much as we would wish that decisions are made for that. We heard the CEO of, was it Danone North America yesterday, right? Like, he's a firm believer, and they're a firm believer, it is the right case for business. So if you can find other examples of organizations doing the right thing, showing that it affects the bottom line, if that bottom line is what's blocking progress, then find reasons to show that it will improve the bottom line, and be unapologetic in your pursuit of doing that.
Yeah, I can pick up on that information sharing point. I think that's really going to be the key moving forward, especially for B Corps, which have the stated commitment to climate justice, and other companies more broadly, because so many companies now have a DEI goal and a climate goal, but there are still so few great examples of what it means to work deeply at the intersection of climate and justice. So I think sharing information among like-minded companies on examples of what it actually looks like to do this will be really useful, and I think that represents an opportunity for B Corps to really be leaders in this space among other companies. And another thing I wanted to point out in terms of the possible bandwidth constraints that folks at B Corps experience in trying to do this deep work is, I think a big piece of starting this work is just keeping justice at the forefront of one's mind when thinking about climate and asking the right questions. So, as a consultant, it often falls to the client to bring us the question of, we want to consider DEI when we're choosing a developer partner, or when we're choosing, who's going to install our on-site solar system. And, of course, now we're learning that it also falls to the consultant to suggest to clients that they should be asking those questions. But my point here is that a big part of the work can just be, or a start to the work, can just be raising that question of your partners, of your suppliers. How are you considering climate justice? And that can help, generate more examples of climate justice and just get the ball rolling for everyone, I think.
So you had asked, I think, both about kind of employee engagement and kind of executive leadership. On climate action, there's been a real range of ways that I see companies end up gravitating there. One example is a company that is now a B Corp. They are a B Corp because one of their major customers happened to be Danone. They wanted to just keep loyalty and make sure they were still buying their products. So that's part of what they did. We work with them on carbon footprinting. So there can be sort of a customer pull. We've also seen a lot because investors are now cared about ESG. That's gotten a lot more attention from boards and executive leadership than was the case even 4 years ago. And within ESG, you can also fit in DEI. But your question actually made me think, because I've seen also sustainability staff within companies, if they don't have as much leadership, one thing they'll try to do is kind of sign up to specific programs, like EPA Energy Star or RE100 has these different corporate challenges. I'm not up to speed on DEI challenges like that, but it would be very interesting to think about if there's a challenge to get more people of color on your board or whatever it is, to have a climate justice essentially associated kind of program like that.
Thank you, and that's a great segue to my next question, which is, what do you feel are the top resources needed to do this work, to center justice and climate action? At B-Lab US and Canada, we have some resources that we've rolled out. We have a lot more to come, no pressure onto me, but what are the resources that will be most valuable to this community? And I ask that because I think there's a lot out there. I think there is a lot of good resources. There's also a lot of noise. And so how do we parse through that? And y'all have been doing this work. You're really experts in the climate action piece and centering justice. What would you say are the kind of top 2 or 3 resources, organizations, things that you think that this audience should be aware of?
I can jump in. I think what David just brought up is an excellent idea of a resource that we could use, some sort of, corporate standard or corporate collaborative that centers on climate justice could be an interesting way to get folks aligned. To sort of rehash a point I've been making throughout this conversation, and I think has come from the other panelists as well, is that we just really need to be sharing and continuing to share more examples of what it looks like to act on climate justice. And I think the B Corp Climate Playbook has been in my mind, a watershed resource for that. That was one of the best resources I was able to find that compiles examples of what it actually looks like for companies to work on this. And then a final idea is, I think there are a lot of resources out there now that help companies make the business case for decarbonization. And perhaps the next step is resources to help companies make the business case for climate justice in cases where executive buy-in is unfortunately not pre-existing. One example I've seen is that I believe it was Unilever turns to their suppliers and their employees and asks them about how they are already being impacted by climate change and how they expect to be impacted by climate change, which you can imagine is particularly relevant for agricultural suppliers, and uses that to make a business case for why they need to act on climate justice. But I think there's a lot of room to do some thinking and sharing and publishing about how other companies can also make that business case and secure that executive buy-in.
And I'm still thinking about your question because it's a good one, and I think it runs into some of the definitional problems we had before. You mentioned the climate playbook, which is a lot more about process, but not about specific things that you can do. So it's, I guess it's a resource to set you on a path, but it still doesn't necessarily dictate, what you do. And I think just coming back to these patterns or things that people have done, a long time for environmental justice, like community engagement, just understanding where wherever your facilities or where you're sourcing from, just really engage in that community, understand the impacts you have, understand the problems that they're having, and make some investments, given they're your supplier and they're your community, into making improvements. But that's not sort of a neat quote unquote resource. It's just more of a process or pattern that I think we all need to be working on.
I haven't read the entire climate justice playbook yet, so I'm sure that, as you said, Tory, I'm sure that that's a great resource. So I will make a point to finish it for sure. But I'm just thinking about maybe flipping it, instead of climate justice, climate comes first, and then making sure that it's just, but maybe flipping it and thinking about justice issues first, and there will likely be a climate impact, whatever it's related to. So if as you saw with Scope 3, it's everything that your business touches directly or indirectly has some sort of a footprint. So maybe just having a better understanding of the human rights, justice, DEI issues that are related to any aspect of your business, and anything that jumps out, either for you or your competitors, or it's a commodity issue, or it's a regional issue. If there's anything that you're touching that already has issues in that realm of JEDI, then you could likely, find a climate solution that could address those as well. So, it's not a concrete website to go to or a book to read. But again, that's understanding your business, understanding each aspect of your business, and understanding where the challenges are from a human rights perspective, and then, kind of stacking the climate on top. So maybe justice and climate kind of thing, and thinking about the justice first could be an approach, but yeah, I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm not sure.
Thank you. And you just gave me some ideas that I'm going to take back to my desk next week and think about acting on for next year. I think that, Tory, your point around concrete examples is so true and so valid. We need the examples of the companies that are doing this work in order to set the path forward for other companies to, not copy them, but to follow suit and to innovate from there. But we need that starting point. So I'm excited to think about that in the next few months. I have a couple more questions, and then we'll see if anyone in the audience has anything before we wrap up. But I want to dig a little bit deeper into the Scope 3 piece, because I think we all know that Scope 3 is one of the most overwhelming, daunting parts of emissions reductions and carbon accounting. And it's also where I see the biggest opportunity to center justice and to support communities and to really think about what was said this morning around the difference of being valuable and being valued. I think that there's a lot within Scope 3 where we can think about what is the justice component, how do we make sure that folks along the supply chain are valued, and what are those intersectional issues. So you've touched on it a little bit, but if any of you have anything more to add on that, looking at Scope 3 and really maybe like kind of the ways that rise to the top for you of how to center justice there, I'd love to dig into that.
Yeah, I can start by expanding on the procurement strategy piece that I touched on earlier, on how companies should think about integrating justice and climate in a consolidated procurement strategy. The point that I think would be a value add here to draw out is that thinking about procurement strategies, I think most folks' minds typically go to shifting your suppliers to lower carbon suppliers or more diverse suppliers. But I think the key here is to realize that companies have a lot of latitude when they're creating a procurement strategy. Shifting away from a supplier that doesn't meet your procurement criteria is in some ways a sort of punitive and strict approach. And companies can take an approach of a very different spirit when they're also looking to support their smaller suppliers and their more diverse suppliers, and continue their relationships with those suppliers and value them by means of looking at their procurement strategy more as an opportunity for engagement and support and driving climate action that wouldn't otherwise have happened among those suppliers instead of dropping the suppliers. So that could look like connecting their suppliers in some sort of training events or forums to discuss climate action. It could look like providing suppliers with resources and educational materials to help them start their greenhouse gas footprinting journeys and target setting journeys and reducing their emissions.
Yeah, I can touch on that as well. So that procurement, look at each category, and while they're all technically indirect, you can have an influence on some of them. Find out based on what your business, the nature of your business, which category can you influence and how you can influence it, and then maybe take a look at the level of influence you believe you can have relative to the footprint of that particular category, and just kind of do a weighted calculation there and find where you want to lean into more. So through procurement, through sustainable procurement, we feel like we can have an impact. We can choose who we buy from, and that's by far and away the biggest category. So that's our main objective. Like I said, capital goods, we can't really control how the steel is manufactured for some of our capital assets that we're going to purchase. So don't have as much control there. The fuel and energy services upstream from where the electricity is generated, we don't have much control over there. Even the end of life with consumers, we have a bit of control, but for some of those hard to abate categories, or maybe looking for, that's where our offset strategy we believe is going to live. But where we can actually have influence on reducing the absolute emissions of that scope 3 category, that's where we want to lean in and take the in-setting route. And once we're comfortable in a few years' time, which requires a lot of patience that I'm learning, especially in agriculture, once we're comfortable that we've done a lot of work there, then we can kind of look to offset for those issues. So I would just say, run through, see where you believe you have an influence, and make plans and strategies to go there. Where you don't, it's just a less priority. But you got to start somewhere. So pick something, start, try, fail, do it again.
Yeah, and I'll just say quickly, so just thinking about scope through, so procurement's kind of in the purchase goods and services, and it makes sense, there's a lot of attention there, because that's where probably you have the strongest supplier relationships. It's the people that you want ingredients, raw materials, and packaging from. And then Taylor hit on about at least three other, I think, portions of scope 3. Two others where I think climate justice could potentially be relevant would be waste. So like looking at where's your waste going, how is that impacting communities, and kind of working on addressing that. And then distribution would be the other, whether it's sort of upstream or downstream, but going back to sort of like diesel pollution in communities, that can be an issue, and electrification can help with that, but there's other distinct strategies to help communities there.
I would just add on that other elements of scope 3 piece that I think investments are another interesting place to look at and make sure that those align with your climate justice objectives as well.
Which is an area not a lot of people measure, but carbon bankroll report and other thing is sort of elevating kind of your financial holdings actually have a footprint to them too.
Thank you for bringing that piece in. It's often overlooked, and yet so important to really follow the money and make sure that your investments, something that all companies have, right? Our 401ks, our mutual funds are not fueling the climate crisis. Thank you for that, Tory. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to open it up. I've been asking a lot of questions of our panelists. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask one or all of our speakers? We do have time for like one question, and don't be shy. You can shout it out. I won't make you speak into the mic, but I know y'all have been digesting a lot of this. So does anyone have anything they really want to ask? Yes, in the back right there. You. Yeah.
I'll just stand up for it. David Cantwell is my name, public policy advisor from Australia, as you can probably tell from the accent. Just one question around the role of government in all of this, and interested from Tory and David in terms of the advice you're giving clients. We're looking with a few a coalition of advisors at a major project in a South Asian country where sovereign risk is going to be a big issue. We're getting third-party capital interested and involved is going to be in part about, for them, de-risking the approach that particular government is going to take over the long term. So, sensitive area, I know, but in general, to the extent, David and Tory, you can comment about the advice you're giving clients around engaging with government and perhaps de-risking that issue of how public policy might change in longer-term climate projects. Taylor, from your perspective, obviously you're in a global supply chain, interested about, you talked about South America, but in your global work, do you take government along with that journey? Obviously, there's going to be potentially winners and losers economically within the countries that you're getting supply from. So just that public policy government piece in general, interested to get some comment from the panel on how that's been tackled.
Great, thank you. And I will repeat for the folks at home, just in case you couldn't hear that. So just generally, the question was around what is the role of government? And I heard, how do you navigate working with governments in other countries, through suppliers, and as if your business or company is at a more global scale? And what is the role that public policy plays? And really, how do you partner with government, but also be aware of some of the challenges, and what are those challenges in climate action centered in justice?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to how governments or how businesses are doing that domestically, and I don't know the landscape in Australia, so I apologize. But there's core company with a lot of sectors I work. There's some core organizations that a lot of people kind of pool their efforts with. So when I would look for any companies here involved with like U.S. or one federal policy, Ceres is one, CERES. For food processing companies, there is the Climate Collaborative that has like 9 challenges, and they have been really trying to push us to be more active on policy and advocacy. And one I'm involved with, and actually have been getting a lot of airtime or play with, is called the American Sustainable Business Network. And a lot of these organizations will actually like work together, but they're advocating usually the federal government, although they do have some state level policies depending on depending on the issues that are at play. But there are certainly organizations, definitely in the U.S., that are sort of pooling companies together, so you don't have to figure out where you're going to advocate or how to navigate. And those have been very helpful for I do a fair amount of advocacy actually, so I found them quite helpful.
Thanks. I can just add on to that on how 3 Degrees advises clients around working with certain governments and can incorporate justice into those considerations. I think in any procurement effort we're looking at, whether it's renewable energy or carbon credits, we certainly look at risks involved with the project, including reputational risk, which sounds like it may come up in the Southeast Asian project that you're discussing with the government in question. And we also incorporate elements that look at community engagement that's associated with the project, ensuring that no ecological or social harm will come from the project. And I think we could take that a step further to center equity and justice to a greater degree, to ask how the project will actually benefit local communities. Will a carbon project, for example, also deliver revenue back to the local communities, et cetera? But I think that's how we would manage the risk to project execution, the risk of harm, and the reputational risk of working with a certain government.
That's a great question. Advocacy is a huge piece, and we're still finding our feet in that world. So I can speak briefly to our domestic efforts. We're part of the Canadian Organic Trade Association. We had our summit last week, and then on Monday, and then Tuesday we were in Ottawa talking to the MPs, advocating for the sector, and aligning the sector goals with the federal, environmental targets. So that's one way. Find out what your sector, with the goals and the needs of your sector, how that relates to the goals of the government, and push in and maybe represent. You represent a fair amount of that, the value in that sector. Lean in where you can. I think we got very lucky. I didn't think about this through this lens before, but we have a project in Mexico that's about a sustainability education center. It happens to be linked with a school called the CETAC, which is a state-funded school, I forget the name of the term, but it's about teaching kids essentially the technical skills for water stewardship. So we're in with the school for that project, and then in Peru, LCA Foods is a community. I would recommend checking it out. They're a national a conference community, and we went to that conference in Lima to try and find some experts to help us with embedding the LCA in our project that we're going to scope in a few months. So in with the university, in with the state level, it's a polytechnic school. So I think schools could be a way to get in because it is federally, it's related to the government, and then maybe that can have some upward pressure. But yeah, that's all we got.
So we are 2 minutes over, and I want to honor everyone's time and energy in being here and get us all off to lunch. So if you'll just join me in thanking and giving a round of applause to David, Tory, and Taylor. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And in closing, if you could each just give kind of your 30-second, what should folks take away from this, and what's like the one thing that they can go and do from the session?
Climate justice is hard. Keep working at it.
Yeah, I would say just start by asking the questions. And the one thing I really want folks to take away is the absolute utmost importance of working with local partners to understand what justice and equity look like in different communities.
Yeah, I mean, those are amazing. Hopefully you work in an organization where you are not afraid to fail and then just try. And that's how you learn. So let's try and fail and try again.
Thank you.
I have a lot of made good vouchers I don't want to go home with, by the way, so please come up and take some. Thank you.